Hello, it is Drake again, and I hadn't, this video wasn't in my, oh, I'll make a video about this, but it's been something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, and I think more and more after I reorganized my bookshelves. It really helped crystallize some ideas that I had kind of been having intuitively, I think, and then they become much more obvious after reorganizing my shelves. And that is this idea of, kind of great books is, I think, the way I'll start by getting into this. And just by coincidence, I stumbled across this, he's a professor, but he makes YouTube videos. I'll put a link to his channel or one of his interesting videos that I've watched. His name is Alexander Arguelles, and he's one of these kind of polyglot professors, but he might be the most legit of these kind of polyglot people. And one of the things that he's doing is he's running, as he calls, an academy, where one of the aspects of the academy, along with learning languages, ranging from Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and so on. He's also doing a great books book club where they're not using specifically the great books of the Western world set that University of Chicago put together in the 1950s, and then there was a reprint in the 90s. But I think that's kind of the inspiration, because he does have a video where he has that in the background and kind of talks about it. But what I especially like about him, in contrast to a bunch of the other people that I've stumbled across talking about the great books, is that he very strongly recognizes the fact that this great books of the Western world has, of course, it's only confined to the Western world, but why would it only be confined to the Western world? Many people who get that set or are interested in reading the great books never get beyond the Western world. But then also, one of the aspects of that great book series is that there's a gap from the year 400 to 1200, where just, apparently nothing happened. And incidentally, that is the gap that I recognized in myself, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, got more kind of formalized maybe a year or so ago. And then I've been working on trying to fill that globally, but Europe I was especially weak on, given how much I know about Europe, in the classical age and then kind of Renaissance and onwards. So it just so happens I stumbled across his videos, and then thinking about this idea of the great books, but also from the more comprehensive perspective that he takes from it, that I tend to take too, is that why confine ourselves to the Western world when information is globally connected nowadays, and it has been realistically maybe for, I don't know, 150 years, if you're thinking about significant influence of China and parts of Africa and so on and so on. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, just some of my thoughts on it. One of the books that I found in the last few months that also kind of helped me formalize my thoughts on this is this book here, The Great Civilized Conversation by William Theodore DeBary. And he's the guy, this is published by Columbia. He was at Columbia for, I don't know, 50 years or something like that. And he helped publish a lot of the Asian classics that Columbia put out. They were one of the big early American presses, back in the 1950s, 60s, to have a really strong series on, Chinese literature and Indian literature and so on. He also does those big anthologies of, sources of the Japanese tradition, sources of the Chinese tradition, and Indian tradition. He's always an editor on those big anthologies. So that's where his name kind of stuck in my mind. And then being that I'm a teacher and the program that I teach in, it's English literature, but there's basically a requirement that half of the books that we read have to be translated into English. And so that really allows us some freedom. Like last year, I added in Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry, Sanskrit poetry, and Aztec poetry as kind of like a book club setup where students got to pick what they wanted and read that. And that was really just out of my own interest. I had read all that stuff on my own. And then I kind of wanted to get some, like, I don't know, maybe some authority behind it or something like that. And so this book is not as comprehensive as I was wanting. It's more a collection of essays that he had written or talks that he had given. But I do like the idea, education for a world community. Because I think really in our time right now, and maybe you could push it back, maybe up to 100 years ago, like 1920s, 1930s, really the average person has had access to more high quality world culture than any other group ever. And when I think about, thinking about my ecology video, you can think about all the negatives that our world brings to the world, our culture brings to the world. If you look at mammals, the biomass of wild mammals is 4%, and then people are 30%, and domesticated animals are 60%, and so the vast majority of fossil fuels that have ever been burned have been burned since 1970, the first Earth Day. PFAS, the list goes on. But then I try to think about, okay, well, what are the things in a positive direction that we have access to that might give us a chance to fix some of this or to think in a better way? And I think it's pretty clear that any way of thinking up until now on its own is insufficient, because surely it would have prevented what's happening now. But I do think that there is an opening for combinations of ways of thinking that have already existed, but that have not been fully cultivated together. And I think that's one of the things that people in our day and age have access to first, like for the first time ever. And I remember reading about Napoleon when he was, conquering the world and, trying to ruin as much as he could. He brought scholars down to Egypt, and he got all sorts of people translating world classics for him. And even someone like me, kind of I don't even know what you'd categorize me as, but financially a thoroughly normal person in the United States, I can pretty easily, even working minimum wage, I can pretty easily have a better library than Napoleon, one of the most powerful people 200 years ago. And so, in the sense of like the content of what I have and the access to knowledge that I have and so on like that. So surely then that means that we could have some kind of a global culture. Not everyone's going to be on board, but like maybe a certain like 0.1% of people can kind of cultivate a universal kind of great books culture, great music, great art, all this kind of thing, and make something of it and do something valuable with it, make the world a better place fundamentally. And of course, that sounds very high and high-minded and so on, but in the end, why not? So this book kind of formalized some ideas, and then just on my own, even before reading any of this, I've just been thinking about, man, I know a decent amount about Renaissance to the present in European context, but I know very little outside of that. You know, you could say Greeks and Romans, I know a little bit, but really not nearly as much as I should. And, you know, that got me thinking about my formal education I got. And I know I made a whole rant video about this, so I won't go at length. And it's kind of obvious to anyone who you know, has a couple brain cells to rub together. But, you know, the default education system in the United States is just like strikingly awful. And while it is true that things could always be worse, it's almost amazing how bad things are given the access to resources that we have in the United States. Like when you think about the fact that the United States, you know, let's say in 1990, was the wealthiest and most powerful entity ever in human history, had the most access to resources, had, you know, probably access to the most knowledge that any single political entity and citizenry had access to ever. And then I look on the other hand of like what we did with that. What did we do with all of those resources? What did we cultivate as a society? And really, I can't think about that very long because I get very depressed. You know, I think about what kind of music is popular today, and what, you know, how many books the fundamentally average person reads, and just the general state of education and the general knowledge base of the average teacher in a high school or in a college, the average student in even a fairly good university like the one that I went to. You know, my classmates knew, you know, let's say in a class of 30, I might have had 2 classmates that, you know, weren't just depressingly uneducated. And that was even just like if you confine it to Western culture. Like just in Western culture, they just didn't know anything, let alone including, you know, any kind of, you know, Chinese and Indian and, you know, Mayan stuff and any of that, which surely we should be able to cultivate. I mean, if not us, who? And so, yeah, I've been on my own trajectory. I think because of such a poor formal education, I've had to teach myself anything I was going to learn. And so that's part of the reason why I think I like this Alexander Arguelles, at least how he was thinking about things. I mean, he's effectively an autodidact too. He did go to better universities when they were better. You know, he went to Columbia for the Great Books program, and then University of Chicago, he got a PhD in languages and comparative religion. But yeah, I'll just kind of share some of my thoughts on great books. And like I said, rearranging my bookshelves really made it clear to me, because, you know, when you start your bookshelf with Epic of Gilgamesh and ancient Egyptian literature, and then you get into the Rig Veda and the Upanishads, Plato, Aristotle, the Tao Te Ching, Virgil, and then you end up with, you know, skipping a little bit, you know, Dante, Petrarch, Shakespeare, Spinoza, and then you see this shelf behind me. This is the shelf of everything written, starts in 1960 up at the top, and then it goes down to the present. When you know, if you hold these 2 books together, like, okay, here's John Donne, and then here's like any one of these books, it's just like, oh, I'm putting them on the same shelf, you know, and it really clarifies for me, like, what do I want to spend the rest of my life reading? You know, you get one life, and that's it. And you know, I'm 29 right now, and I think, you know, I probably have like double my current lifespan, so I probably have about another 30 years of like fully functioning intellect, you know, where I have a good memory and I can read quickly and my eyes are going to be good and all this sort of thing, to the degree that anything is predictable. And so I think, okay, what do I want to spend the next 30 years of my life reading? Like that I, you know, where I have full access to my mental capacity, and, you know, what do I want to do? And that's another part of the reason why I've been getting rid of so many books, because it really clarifies things when you think that way. And yeah, one of the people who thought like this too was Ford Madox Ford. This book I have of his, The March of Literature, with an introduction by Alexander Theroux of Darkinville's Cat fame. As it says on the back, this 900-page survey of world literature from Confucius's day to our own. It's the last book that Ford Madox Ford wrote, and I'm just kind of using it as a set piece almost to talk about that idea where, 100 years ago, 1938 is when this book came out, but of course Ford Madox Ford had to have been reading this stuff before then to be able to talk about it. 100 years ago, if you were a fairly wealthy, privileged person, you could read everything. You could, the sacred books of the East that Max Muller was putting out from Oxford, 50 of the greatest books of India, China, and so on. You would, of course, have had access to all of the best stuff ever written in the so-called Western tradition, access to all Egypt stuff. The information on like Native Americans and Mayans and all this kind of thing would have been pretty paltry, but you would have had access to some of it. And then same thing with like oral epics of Africa and, different, novels that came out of there. That would have been pretty paltry too. But nonetheless, at least like this great civilized conversation, this idea of like very highly complex literate cultures, you would have had access to all of it. But only if you were a wealthy gentleman like Ford Madox Ford himself. The average person like me, born in 1890, almost certainly would have not had access to any of this. Maybe if I could go to a like a New York Public Library, I could kind of sneak some of it. But yeah, so that's the great thing about living in our time today, is that we have access to so much of it. But then it's troubling that so few people take advantage of what we have access to. So I'm trying to kind of spur myself along and actually use some of what the joys of 2024 are for what limited amount there may be. So thinking about this idea from Confucius, I just recently picked up this set of James Leggie's The Chinese Classics, which would have been available to Ford Madox Ford and many other people of the modernist era, loved Leggie's translations, and they are available, freely online. You can find PDFs of them legally, and I would highly recommend doing that. Just download out all of it and read it whenever you can. But, really I'm to the point in life where it costs so little in the grand scheme of things to cultivate at least a fairly substantial personal library that, if you can get a hold of it physically, you might as well. And I've been able to, so I much prefer the physical books. But yeah, Confucius, the Confucian Analects, the Great Learning, and then the Doctrine of the Mean. And interestingly enough, reading the Chinese classics and poetry especially, but also, books like this with really thorough commentary and a 100-page introduction, I think kind of surprisingly, it helped me more fully appreciate people like Dante Alighieri with his Divine Comedy. Because when I would read that book, and I think this is a more typical perspective, even for someone who, tries to read widely and, does want to be somewhat educated. You're reading the Divine Comedy, and then you come across all these names you've never heard of, or maybe you've heard of, but you don't know much about them. And it can be hard to find a foothold. Now, that's not so much of a problem, at least in the Inferno, because there's so much, striking detail and, really compelling characters. And in the Purgatory, I think even more so, the characters in the Purgatory, I think, are fascinating. I'm really enjoying Purgatory, which I'm currently about halfway through and hoping to finish in the next day or two. We'll see. But yeah, I think like surprisingly, unexpectedly, reading the Chinese classics helped me more fully appreciate the scholarship that Dante had access to. And then, of course, when you consider the fact that Thomas Aquinas had lived just before, the generation before Dante, and they themselves are really like the peak, the absolute peak of this scholasticism of the Middle Ages. And then one thing I was surprised to find is that Petrarch's father knew Dante, in person. And, Petrarch's usually considered kind of like one of the earliest figures of this Italian Renaissance. But then that really crystallized the idea of like, how can you actually separate someone like Dante from the Renaissance? I mean, of course, without Dante or without the cultural access that Dante had to his knowledge, you don't get the Renaissance. And yeah, there are some differences. I mean, when you read Dante, he does feel a little bit like parochial and archaic compared to someone like Petrarch or someone I'm going to talk about in a little bit, Erasmus. It is just kind of, I think it's overdone, this kind of connection of, the Italian Renaissance, like, it's just like this amazing flowering. But even just mentioning the Italian Renaissance, I can't help but think about the fact that with my students who are, 17, 18 years old, 16, 17, 18, before we read Dante, I wanted to make sure they understood the historical moment that Dante lived in, and I asked my students, okay, who can explain the Italian Renaissance to me? And on average, in a class of 30, there was only one student who could tell me even like one paragraph off of Wikipedia depth of the Italian Renaissance. And I was pretty horrified by that. I was pretty horrified. And I think you wouldn't find much different data if you ask the average, class at a public university, okay, give us a 2-paragraph summary of the Italian Renaissance with the 5 most important names that someone should know. And I think that's really troubling that that's such an unusual bit of information. But nonetheless, this kind of Dante, but then when you read Dante, you think, well, how did Dante have access to all this information? And then you Aquinas, and then, well, Aquinas is clearly like the mountain peak of a tradition. Well, where's this tradition? In the great books of the Western world, it's just a black hole, and then Aquinas pops out of nowhere. Wow, he must be really intelligent. But I've had to totally educate myself kind of on my own about this information, and it's kind of an old thing now. Oh, the Dark Ages never existed. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely true. Just a quick footnote: if you want, in my opinion, the best anthology of classical Chinese literature, this is it, by John Minford and Joseph Lau, published by Columbia and the Chinese University Press. It is just a beautiful anthology, 1,300 pages and 1,200 pages with an amazing bibliography, and it gets you up to the Tang Dynasty, so 900 AD roughly, and yeah, it's just awesome. As you can see, I'm working my way through it now. All right, and then a couple important middle ground pieces of information before you get to the main thing I want to talk about today. So, of course, you have the Carolingian Renaissance, which was kind of centered around Charlemagne. And I want to read just a section from a poem in here. So some of the names that you might know. There is Alcuin, who was the most impressive scholar in Charlemagne's court. You have Einhard, who wrote a biography of Charlemagne. You have Rabanus Maurus, who Elliot Weinberger kind of highlighted in his Angels and Saints, which is incidentally one of the books that kind of plugged me into this, to lighten up the Dark Ages for me. And then there's an interesting figure named John Scotus Eriugena, who's the Irishman, page 300 of this volume. And I just want to read you the first few lines of one of his poems. So all of these are written in Latin at this time. Another good book for, illuminating this period is Ernst Curtius, his European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages. Just, amazing work of scholarship. All right, so this poem here is called My Poetry and My Times. And this poem was written around the year 800, maybe 850, at most. So kind of think about Beowulf is probably being composed for the first time. The Poetic Edda is probably coming together around this time. Du Fu has just died, the greatest Chinese poet. The Islamic Golden Age is in full swing, so amazing works of scholarship are coming out of, Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, and all this kind of stuff. And I would say comparatively, Europe is kind of at a low point in terms of scholarship and literature. But you can still read a poem that starts like this. Homer once sang of his Hellenes and Trojans, and Virgil composed verse about the descendants of Romulus. Let us sing about the kindly deeds of the King of Heaven, whom the world never ceases joyously to praise. Homer and Virgil took pleasure in speaking about the flames that brought sudden destruction to Troy and about the struggles of their heroes, but our delight is to sing of Christ. And he goes on and kind of talks about that. But that just makes it obvious that, people in like the deep, dark ages, never lost a connection to Homer and Virgil, the classical period. Now, as you see in that poem, it was like kind of subjugated to Catholic Christianity, but it was still valued, Varying people valued it more than others, but it's clear when you read Beowulf that the person who wrote it, the person who composed it, had read the Aeneid. It's pretty obvious at certain points. And that really struck me when I was like, when I was reading Beowulf, and a couple of years ago, 4 years ago now, I had realized holy crap. Because Beowulf, it's clearly written by someone who's in the Christian era, but they're trying to save this world that they know is just a thread away from being lost forever. Like Cao Cui-chin writes about in the Story of the Stone or the Dream of the Red Chambers. He's trying to save for posterity this life that he knows is going to be forgotten, maybe even in his lifetime. Or what's that book I have over here? The Islandman by Thomas O'Crowan, where he writes, why did you write this book? And he says, because a people such as us will never exist ever again. And he wanted to save it. And I think, of course, that's the heart of writing, is to save what is beautiful. And so yeah, the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne's time, they were reading Virgil and Homer in Latin. They probably didn't have access to the Greek at all, if anyone could even read Greek at the time. But then, so that's about 800, and then you have another 400 years where you get to this handsome fellow right here, Dante. And I won't spend too much time on Dante because I'll probably talk about it a lot more at length, coming up in the next month or so once I finish the Paradise 2. But I've just been thrilled. I've had this book on my shelf for a few years now, Praise of Folly. And I have to say, I kind of categorize it as like an obvious classic, but I had never met anyone who's read it. And, it seemed to me like, obviously, you have it on the shelf and you read it. But I hadn't prioritized it. I didn't have a clear idea of who Erasmus was. And I think it's because I didn't have a clear idea of the tradition that he was operating out of. You know, I would say he's really kind of in the position of, you know, a Petrarch or a, who else? Yeah, Dante even. I mean, he's at the absolute peak of medieval scholasticism, but then he's kind of peeking over and seeing what the next 600 years is going to look like, at least like intellectual culture, literate culture. And yeah, I just picked it up off the shelf and just cracked it open, and I was just blown away within 20 pages. I mean, so The Praise of Folly, it's, if you're not familiar with it, it's from the perspective of folly. Folly is, you know, personified. And then it's an encomium, or a praise, you know, speech to Folly. So Folly is speaking about herself in a praiseful way. And it's just an amazing satire. I mean, if you like Lawrence Stern, if you like William Gaddis, you will love Erasmus. And I also think one of the other things that really struck me is just the level of scholarship that Erasmus had access to is really deep. And you know, it feels like reading Dante with all the allusions and different things. Now, you can read it without catching any of the allusions. It's still a you know, a functioning book on its own, which really Dante really isn't, I think. But yeah, Erasmus, I was just blown away. And it reminds me of something like The Anatomy of Melancholy with the density of allusions. And I just love that. I really just deep down, I just love scholarship. Like, I love this idea of like a, you know, intricate network, almost like Byzantine network of cultural connections and overlaps and allusions and kind of, you know, quotations. And it just makes reading such a rich experience. You know, it's like you don't even have to annotate it yourself. The book is like pre-annotated with all the inherent meanings behind all the words and all the phrases and all the, you know, references and things. And that was really the thing I loved most about reading The Praise of Folly. A couple of the other things I loved is that, like, I truly think Erasmus, like, if he has just been transported, you know, he was born in 1466. If he had been like plucked, time machined to you know, 2024, I don't think he'd be surprised by anything. You know, a couple of technological things, the fact that we can fly in a big aluminum tube through the air, I might be surprised by that, but like thought-wise, he wouldn't be surprised by the scientific revolution. He wouldn't be surprised by, you know, maybe even like quantum mechanics. He wouldn't be surprised by, you know, Wittgenstein or something like that. I think he would be just, oh yeah, you know, I get it, you know, that's not too far from where we were at in my day. Of course, Erasmus might have been, you know, maybe the most intelligent person in Europe at the time. One of them, at least. And yeah, so I just blasted through Praise of Folly, and now I'm kind of on an Erasmus rabbit hole. I want to read his Adages, which University of Toronto has they're working on a complete works of Erasmus, which is going to be like, what, 80 something volumes, I think, in the full set. But I was able to pick up also a biography of his, published by University of Toronto. And I guess the Toronto connection is the Catholic connection, because Erasmus was a Catholic. Same with his really good friend Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, which I've never read, but I'm going to read really soon. And Thomas More seems like a really interesting figure too. He's another one where I just had in mind his Hans Holbein portrait, you know, and I was just like, you know, what did this guy do? Okay, Utopia, okay, you know, now we have dystopias, and it's kind of satirical, but yeah, something just clicked with me, you know, doing all this reading of the Carolingian Renaissance, reading Dante, reading Petrarch. I've loved Chaucer, but Chaucer just feels so different somehow to me. But now, you know, this tradition is being fully fleshed out, and I just love kind of discovering this kind of thing. But yeah, and reading Erasmus has been just an absolute joy. So yeah, great books. I think that's just what I'm going to read. You know, that's what I'm going to try to read for the next 10 years or so. I did make, you know, kind of like my ecological reading list. I made myself, just personally, a great books list. Like, if I couldn't buy another book for the rest of my life, what do I want to have in my personal library that I will just read for the rest of my life? And right now the list has 264 authors. 264 authors. And I was disturbed with how few I'd actually read with any depth, because I put a number to it. Oops, I had a technical difficulty, so my video cut off. So I guess that's a message that I needed to have ended it there, but I couldn't stop without recommending yourself to, you know, read something you've always wanted to read, but for some reason that, you know, you keep putting it off. And I think that's what I'm going to try to do for however long I can manage it. And yeah, death is a gang boss.